And John, you're going to lose a water bottle behind your screen.
Oh, thank you. Water. I feel special now. We all good? Okay. All right. Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome. This is the Town Council Finance Committee regular meeting, Wednesday, September 22nd, 4 o'clock start time. First item is call to order, and then those present, we have all members present. Next item of business is the approval of minutes from July 14th. Do I have a motion?
So moved. Second.
Any discussion? Colette, would you call the vote?
Councillor Johnson,
Yes.
Councillor Pucci,
Yes.
Councillor Anderson,
Yes.
vote passes.
Thank you. Next, we have a number of items for discussion, and I think this is going to be somewhat flowing. I'm happy that we have our assessor, Nick Cloutier here, town manager, and assistant manager is also here with us. We started talking about capital reserve triggers at our last meeting, and we didn't have a lot of time for the discussion. It was brought up that one of the first things that we want to make sure that we take care of is unassigned fund balance. Right now, our policy calls for us to have just over 8% as a minimum, a target of 10%, and anything over 12% will go to is directed to go towards some of these capital funds like we're talking about. So I asked Ruth to prepare a summary of where we are as of the end of June. So we only calculate fund balance basically once a year. So we don't know exactly what it is at the end of June because there's still some adjusting entries that are taking place. But, and I don't know if we can bring this up. It's on the agenda.
I can bring it up. Yeah. That's what I was clicking around there for in the beginning.
It looks like because we issued bonds after the close of the fiscal year, that there's a deficit there. We're actually not at the minimum of 8.33%. It's more like 7.25%. And yeah, here it is. So our policy says that you take your current fund balance divided by the prior year's operating budget. And that's what this spreadsheet is doing. It shows you for a couple of years. So 2020, that's a real number. We actually know how we ended 2020. And you can see the actual unassigned fund balance was 7.7 million. And the ratio of the unassigned fund balance to the prior year operating budget was 8.74%. If you jump ahead to 21, we know what our operating budget was. It was 96 million. We're estimating that the fund balance was 6.835 million. And that gives you a ratio of 7.27%. So our policy calls for us to take action in the next budget cycle to replenish that. So there's a caveat though, because we issued bonds this year and we had, I don't know if this is the right word, essentially borrowed money from ourselves for some capital projects that had been approved with the intention of paying ourselves back after we issued the bonds. So now that we've issued the bonds, there's about 1.3 million, I believe, that would actually go back to unassigned fund balance, bringing our ratio just over 8%, but we're just over the minimum. So we're at the minimum. I guess the question for the council or for the committee is, are there any actions that you would like to see us take to try to get it above the minimum or towards the 10%? Or even getting closer to the 12%, because I think when we start talking about capital reserve triggers, we really should be at that 12% level. So I don't know if anybody has any thoughts on that.
And can someone just give a little bit of history of like the 8.33 and the 12%? Like, how did we derive those, and how do we compare it to other towns?
Yeah, we worked closely with our financial advisor, also took guidance from GFOA, which is the Government Finance Officers Association. The 8.33, I think, represents 1/12 of our, a month's operating expense. And so that's generally the minimum that they say you got to have on hand. The technical, practical purpose, I guess, of the fund balance is, as the rainy day. It's the checking account or savings account we have in our households, that if the furnace breaks in January, you need to fix it. So that's kind of the bare minimum. That's what our policy has, but it does set two kind of higher targets. I believe, Ruth, correct me if I'm wrong, 10% and 12%. And when we reach those higher levels, our fiscal policy then dictates what you do with that, the additional funds above that.
Mhm.
And I think the chairman is referencing we're kind of right on the margin of meeting our minimum requirement, but we really ought to be striving for that mid and high point. We shouldn't be simply squeaking by every year at the minimum level. Did I say that correctly?
Yeah, I am. Yep, sorry. I'm
Hi, can you hear me?
A
Yeah.
follow-up to that. In our fiscal policy too, I also saw that we have something in there that states we're trying to have 3 to 4 months of committed funds. So how is that different from what you just described? Because I read that in our fiscal policy as kind of that rainy day, have that available. So is that a separate fiscal policy that we're trying to do, or is it in addition to the fund balance that we're doing that 3 to 4
I believe the
months?
committed funds are calculated, they're part of the overall fund balance. There's 5 or 6 different kind of
Mhm.
categories. Certain of those categories are what we count toward the fund balance calculation. I think Ruth can be far more conversant to it than I.
Can you hear me?
Yep.
The 8.33 is the minimum. 10% is our goal. GFOA actually, the Government Finance Officers Association actually prefers 16%. We don't put that in our policy. Anything above 10% can go towards 3 or 4 different items as it shows in the fiscal policy under fund balance.
Ruth, can you speak to the different components of fund balance?
Oh, there's 4 or 5 different ones. There's restricted, is that what you're talking about? The restricted, assigned and all that? The restricted fund balance are things that we can't really touch. For example, the inventory of the fuel in the ground. That's not something we can convert to cash readily, so that's restricted. For our purposes, the school department's fund balance is considered restricted because we can only use that towards the school department, so we can't use it to buy a dump truck or whatever. So that's also restricted from on the town side. On the school side, it's considered unassigned. And then there's committed fund balance, there's assigned fund balance, and then there's unassigned. The committed and assigned, I tend to mess these two up, but one is based on something that is approved at the council level. And then the other one is approved at the administrative level. And then there's, I think committed is council, assigned is at administration level, and then unassigned is available for whatever purposes we want to use. The fund balance policy, I believe Councilor Babine back in the day reworded some of it, incorporated some of those different aspects of fund balance. And he used the term the unassigned fund balance as the goal that we're basing our percentages on.
Ruth, is that standard?
The 5 different categories.
Well, targeting unassigned fund balances as a ratio to your operating budget.
Technically, we could do that. In the fund balance policy, it does define, I forgot the term, but it includes the committed, the assigned, and the unassigned fund balance.
So for instance, this 7.27% that is on this, for FY21, what categories does that ratio include?
The 7 point, say it again,
7.27.
that is just the unassigned.
So
fund
Ruth,
balance.
Ruth, I think Councilor Chairman Clucci was asking, is that a typical ratio to have in other towns, the unassigned fund balance ratio like we're talking about right now? Is that a typical metric that's used, or?
Oh, yes.
Okay, sorry, that was your question, right? Yeah, okay.
Let me just ask a follow-up. Do some of you include other categories other than unassigned?
Yes, I think we used to include both the assigned and the committed fund balance in addition to the unassigned.
So
But those two are kind of, they include things like purchase orders that we've issued or the sick pay.
So I would suggest that we take a very conservative view of this by using unassigned only. And I suspect other peer communities may use a different mix, frankly. And so we just have to be careful from a comparative point of view.
So when you guys mentioned the organization there,
GFOA.
yes, that one. When you said that, Ruth, when you said they're closer to 16%, is that fund balance or unassigned fund balance? Because certainly those are two vastly different numbers. So I want to make sure we're comparing apples and oranges.
That I'm not sure about. It could be the unassigned. They really want essentially 2 months worth of unassigned fund balance, mostly because it, it's there for catastrophic-ish things such as, like in the Southeast, they've had all those floods and stuff. That unassigned fund balance helps to get them through some of that during their, before like their taxes come in and stuff. And the same thing with out west with all those fires and having to pay all those firemen and stuff. Before any monies actually come in, it gives the communities an opportunity to actually continue their operations. So that's why they want the higher percentages. It helps with the bond ratings as well.
Ruth, can I try to step through an example with you? So we're starting discussions of coming to some kind of agreement with the Downs for some fees that we've collected, impact fees that we've collected, right? So those impact fees today are sitting in a restricted account. Is that accurate?
We have, so the funds that we're talking about right now on the unassigned fund balance, those are all sitting in the general fund. The impact fees are sitting in what's called the special revenue funds, which means that they're collected for specific purposes. Again, we can't use them to like buy a plow truck or whatever. We can only use them for the purpose that was they were initially set up for. So all of our grants are in there, our traffic impact fees are in there because those are designated through policies or ordinances.
So if we take an action as a council to appropriate those monies or allow the town manager to use them, do they become committed or they still stay in the special revenue fund?
What we've done in the past is we might have a capital improvement program, and some of those projects may be funded with impact fees. So for example, the school 8 Corners portable classrooms a few years ago, we funded some of them partially or in whole with school impact fees. And those are just like the other impact fees, they're sitting in a special revenue fund. And so what we do is we show the budget requests under the capital budget, and then we show how it's going to be funded with school impact fees. So it's not coming from property taxes.
We also did it out of budget cycle one year, as I recall. I think they came to us in a bit of a dire circumstance, and council authorized some use of school impact fees. And then they came the subsequent budget year with a CIP request, which again relied at least in part on traffic impact fees. But we did it at budget cycle initially.
So just to further the example of the impact fees, those do not fall under any of those 5 categories of fund balance. Is that correct?
Correct.
Yeah. All right.
They have they're in their own, under special revenue funds, they're in their own
They're in-
5 categories.
There's yet another account, special revenue funds. But once we appropriate those would then be considered assigned. Excuse me, committed, because no, never mind, forget it. You already answered that question.
That's what I was wondering.
Right.
It sounds like no.
No,
They're gonna stay
right.
In their own.
I retract the question because it was a repeat.
Yeah.
I think we just flow into the general fund, or however we spend those funds, we would.
Yeah,
transfer.
I guess that makes more sense, actually. Yeah.
Ruth, a more recent example, the CARES Act money the schools has been receiving over the last couple of fiscal years. Those are special revenue funds, right? They're kept in special revenue accounts.
Yes.
So they're kind of outside of our budget. And, they did provide us some accounting and detail on how they've expensed, but it wasn't part of the budget process. The council didn't touch it, approve it. It all was funneled through a special revenue fund.
And then once we get around to determining how to spend the town's ARPA money, American Rescue Plan monies, those right now we're just spending money, and those are also under the special revenue funds, but that will all flow through the same special revenue funds.
Go ahead, John.
Yeah, I guess just again, what I'm trying to rationalize a little bit in my own mind is, we have these goals for the 8.3% minimum, but then we also have a statement on page 14 of our fiscal policy where we talk about setting aside a reserve for $1 million to cover operations for up to 3 months over a 10-year period. So are we building something separate to inflate the unassigned fund balance with this other piece of our policy? And where are we in terms of creating that fund?
I'll have to look at that. It's been a while, but I don't think I know it's been a goal to set that up, but I don't think we've actually set that up.
Yeah, I do recall there's one very similar language in targets, dollar thresholds for capital funding. But I'll have to look at it too. I didn't recall that there was one for additional funds for operating.
I'm thinking it was for capital, but I could be wrong.
It says it will help to pay for capital and operating costs during revenue deficient months. So I'm looking at page 14. I can read it real quick. It's pretty short. So it's reserve funds. Adequate operating reserves are important to ensure the functions of town, especially during economic downturns. The town desires to build a contingency reserve in the general fund of no less than $1 million. Over the next 10 years of the date of this policy adoption, the town will initiate a committed fund balance for working capital sufficient to finance 90 days of operations, 3 months, but not to exceed 4 months of operations. These funds will help to pay for capital and operating costs during revenue deficient months.
I think that might be considered like a rainy day fund.
And how
However,
does
I
it go
think
from
if you
1
look and
million
see
to
how long
3
this
months of
policy's been in effect, we really haven't been able to put anything towards that.
Because that's where I was assuming, like, when we were talking, because to continue the conversation about unassigned fund balance, when I saw this, I was like, so are we really, if we're doing this, and if that's really our objective, then we are adding more money to an unassigned fund, it seems like, different from our other goal. So just, they were kind of in conflict in my mind, and I wasn't sure what this was actually for and how it ties to what we've been trying to talk about in terms of creating more of a capital reserve fund. And maybe that was the intent of this, and the language just got a little.
I think it may make sense for the finance committee, if you're so inclined, to spend a little time just getting acquainted with that fiscal policy. I mean, the history of that is, I don't know the adoption date, but it strikes me as probably 3 years old or so. It actually was probably 3 or 4 or 5 different policies that were melded into one. And that was a huge undertaking. Peter Hayes really kind of saw that through over a series of years, frankly, through finance committee. And it's obviously staff needs to check in on it more regularly, but it makes sense if it's for you all to check in and see if it makes policy sense to you as well.
So one of my
And I-
questions was, how do we increase fund balance? Is there, we've budgeted to use fund balance before, but I don't think we ever budgeted to increase unassigned fund balance. Is there a mechanism that we have, Ruth?
There are a couple of ways, unintentionally or intentionally, is to, somebody has a department budget, they don't spend all their monies, that will flow to fund balance. Some towns will take their overlay and inflate it purposely to build up fund balance. Other communities, for our excise taxes, for example, we've really tried to estimate those as close to actual as we can. Some communities don't do that. They leave it intentionally lower so that those extra revenues will go to fund balance. So there are a number of ways. Other communities just flat out appropriate monies for fund balance. So there are opportunities to do that. It's just a question of which ones we're more comfortable using.
So it sounds to me like the only intentional way is to just flat out appropriate it, right? And am I wrong in thinking playing around with overlay to pad your fund balance is blurring the lines of an assessor versus the operations of municipality, or?
No, you're exactly right.
Yeah.
But that's the most common method I'm familiar with.
But there's nothing prohibiting us as a council from putting a line item.
This is unassigned fund.
I would say the reason that we haven't done that is just the sensitivity to tax rate. There's always this fixation of keeping the tax rate as low as possible, and that's always something that there's no pain associated, and it's kind of tomorrow's problem. So I think that's why we've not, chosen to do that. Once you make that leap and build it into your operating budget, as an expense, it's fairly easy to maintain that going forward
Right.
without any big swings. But that first corrective year, there's just an over attention to fund balance, to tax rate. And it's easy to push it.
How do you, I mean, I guess, how do you reconcile something that's, this is rhetorical, I guess, but something that by and large is supposed to be incidental and it's an incidental thing from either over budgeting or excess revenue, but then at the same time develop goals around it. It strikes me as odd unless you just create a revenue line and bite the bullet.
Well, in the last couple of budget cycles, you might recall, some of you have been involved when we're aware of, approaching the end of the fiscal year, we're aware particularly that we've got additional revenue coming in above budget, excise in particular. The council's made decisions, in most cases, as I recall, to fund additional capital spending as opposed to fund balance. So these are choices. And to date, we've chosen to do other things other than let it flow to fund balance.
And that kind of relates to that policy we were kicking around last time.
Mhm.
It could be something perhaps excise underestimation of excise revenue ends up going to unassigned fund balance.
And what makes it tricky is we don't know what our unassigned
Right.
ratio is at the time we're making
Yeah,
that
right,
decision. Can I step back to the example with the Downs, because you triggered something, Tom, where the school department got these ARPA funds, right? And they were able to expend them without council approval. We have another example with these school impact fees where they expended them with council approval. I'm wondering for the other impact fees, the transportation related ones, do you need council approval or just, I guess I'm looking for what the sentiment is here. Do we need council approval for that, or is that something that's already defined within the definition of the impact?
Yeah, I think the difference is, in my mind, the impact fees, those are monies that the town, by way of ordinance, imposes, we collect, we hold. So, council's made the legislative decision that, yes, we want these fees. And so you control the appropriation of them. I would say the CARES Act money, we never touched. It never hit our account. It went directly to the school. And so, Ruth, I don't know if you'd agree with that characterization, but in my mind, we never saw those. We're never the stewards of those funds. And therefore, our involvement is inconsequential. That's the difference in my mind. Ruth,
I think that's correct. Even it goes directly to the school department. So I'm not sure that we actually even have a say, except for the fact that they're a part of the town.
And there's things that happen on a routine annual basis. The school gets all sorts of federal grants in support of special education and nutrition, as I recall, that doesn't hit our general fund, but they rely on them consistently year over year to help offset school expenses.
I guess I wasn't trying to pick on the schools necessarily, but so these impact fees never hit our general fund either. And maybe a better example is like police department getting a $400,000, or maybe the fire department getting a $400,000 grant. Is the council going to have any action for them to be able to expend those, or because it's outside of our?
So you're right. The impact fees don't hit the general fund, unless I guess we push it through the budget process.
And that's the same with the grants.
So the relevant point here is the council is the one that needs to grant the appropriation authority. I guess the secondary question is, as a matter of process, do you want them to cycle through the budget process for either transparency or consideration in the context of other priorities? You don't need to. You're the keeper of those funds and can authorize the use of them when and if you wish to for their qualified purposes.
So this is helping another discussion, but and actually I'm not sure, when they passed the ordinance for the impact fees, that to me was the action that the council had to say these funds need to be used for this. From there, it might be an administrative decision that yes, this qualifies, and we're going to talk more about it, I'm sure. But this has helped that discussion.
I feel better with definitive appropriation authority granted to me.
Yeah. Okay.
With the unassigned fund balance, this is money that, doesn't have any purpose, is free to use. The council, that's fully at your discretion to spend it on whatever you wish, whenever you wish. You could decide as a council to spend it all tomorrow if you wished.
We're not going to do that.
No.
I know, I'm coming up with some ideas.
Okay, good.
So
Price
I guess I don't know. I don't know if, or I guess I'm not comfortable making some sort of recommendation because I get it. Like I get that. It seems to me once the 1.3 trickles in from the issuing of bonds, that we're going to be relatively let me pull this up. We're going to be relatively the same as years past. Is that correct?
Close.
And Ruth, that will be a matter for the auditors, correct?
So we're going to be a little bit less than the years past.
Yeah.
To reflect the bond proceeds.
For next year, yeah, or in FY '22.
How you've said in the bond calls, how strong of a signal is it to get the fund balance up? I mean, I just keep going back to whenever we have the audit report and we see 5 peer communities and their fund balances are all over the map. I feel like there's not, so.
Tom and Ruth can comment more. I didn't pick up, that wasn't the top of the list.
Yeah.
It's a big issue for Moody's in particular, and we go to Moody's and Standard and Poor. That's more important to Moody's for whatever reason. Their analytics and underwriting really favors that or values that. I'll dig it out, but our financial advisor, we asked the question, what's the benefit of increasing it? What, show us how many basis points are we going to save on our interest rate, for better bond rating.
Right.
And it was a very minimal return on that commitment. I think it was 5 basis points if we were able to increase our bond rating another step. And we're so high for us to move to the next step is going to be exceedingly difficult.
And I mean, our last bond, we were what, 1.08% or something like that when we.
Yeah, incredibly favorable rates. So, I don't know, it's probably still good financial policy, but I don't know that it's going to produce tangible results in terms of, much better, lower interest rates and therefore debt costs.
One thing they picked on that did stick out for me was we have a receivable for Haggis Parkway that they wanted to see cleared.
Which is
And then we might touch on a little bit later.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah, I think the ends in sight there, there's some good news coming down the road, just with some commitments being met and funds being able to fill that deficit that exists. Yeah,
I'm not hearing any action right now.
Well, I don't know. I mean, I can talk into it. I guess
I don't think any significant action, but are we, because we had on here to talk about funding triggers. So my assumption is before we get into any sort of capital reserve funding trigger, our goal will always be to make sure we have fund balance at least 8.3%.
10%.
Or at 10% or 8.3%.
So the minimum is 8.3%, but the capital triggers kick in, or for the policy, they start kicking in at 10%.
So at 10%.
Or it's optional then, at 12%,
I wasn't here for it, but your valuation policy discussion, it sounds as though fund balance may be a beneficiary or part of that conversation. So I might suggest you advance that policy a bit further to understand what do you do in the event of extra of money, where does that go and at what percentage? Fund balance may be a beneficiary of that. I don't know, but it may make sense to build from this to keep this conversation in mind as you look to flesh out that policy.
where I say when we set goals for the budget or for the year, I see this coming up there where, maybe we give a direction, hey, we'd like to see us approach 10% or maybe next year approach 9%. So we start stepping in that direction.
Yeah, and I guess I just echo what Tom thought. I feel like it slightly changes the conversation we had last time because, we were talking about giving back to the taxpayer or the capital reserve fund. Well, why is it now giving back to the taxpayer and unassigned fund balance, right? If we make this our priority, get this to 10% and then trigger the capital reserve fund, right? So I feel like we're duplicating a couple things.
I see it as like a
Right.
kind of a decision tree of,
Yes, right.
what is our priority 1, 2,
Right.
3,
Right.
and then how do we allocate? And maybe some things we can do percentages, right? If we want to continue to build up something, but we still want to fund the capital reserves. I just think we have to know like what's 1, 2, and
Right.
3.
Well, the fiscal policy does dictate if you get above 10%, the beneficiary is capital. And so, it could be argued that focus attention on fund balance, build it, and then your fiscal policy dictates what happens when you get above 10%.
Now, so just so I'm clear though, the capital reserve account we just created during this last budget season is not tied to that policy we're talking about, right? So we should tie those.
We essentially overrode it.
Right, so.
We should have let it go to fund balance.
Yeah, right, so, right, exactly. Now I'm thinking, why don't we put it? But I mean, shouldn't we have that? we should be sitting with that policy and tie that policy to the capital reserve account that we just created.
Well, it's there, I mean, that.
It's there,
that
it's just another
reserve
one
is-
that's
it
zero.
ties, just technically, we should have allowed fund balance to get to 10%.
Correct, before we do what we did.
We funded.
Well, remember, the other thing that I think we're using that capital reserve fund for initially, and what I'd like to use it for in the future is the fact that funding soft costs, which ultimately turn into projects, there could be 2 and 3 years that before we actually get to the position of bonding and paying ourselves back. So we need to kind of front some money. So we were able to do, I think, library additional engineering work and some school work funded from that. Presumably, one or both of those will ultimately be a bonded project for which we can also include soft costs already invested and kind of replenish that so it's available for the next.
Go ahead, Ruth, I see your hand up.
A couple of things, in regards to the various policies, we're supposed to review at least I think it was the fund balance, one of those policies every 3 years, and we adopted this in September of 19. So we're probably at our 3-year portion, so that might be something we want to include at a future finance committee meeting. And the other piece had to do with the fund balance policy also says exactly what we can use those for once we get above 12%. It does say here that the unrestricted fund balance as a percentage of revenues. The goal is not to drop below 8% with a goal of building unrestricted fund balance to 12%. And that unrestricted includes the committed and the assigned. That helps.
Do you know what our ratio is today if you include the unassigned and the committed?
I don't have that. I can get that for you though.
So maybe next meeting we'll talk about that.
Yeah.
Um,
I guess it's gonna
We'll
look
do that.
better, right?
Yes.
I think so, yeah.
Yeah.
Considerably.
Right.
Okay.
So I'm sorry, I don't want to go around in circles, but the policy speaks specifically to unassigned, not unrestricted. That we just said with the 8%, not below 8%.
In calculating the,
I could pull it, I could find it on the internet.
yeah, the goal is through the unassigned fund balance. but
Which is
then
not
it does-
unrestricted.
But not the unrestricted, right? So.
Right, and
you know,
the umbrella with the unassigned is the unrestricted, the committed, and the unassigned, right? There's 3 under the unassigned umbrella, correct?
Under the unrestricted, right?
Yeah, unrestricted, I'm sorry, I'm getting all the words, I'm sorry. Clear as mud on that one, but I think you got the nature of my question. That policy references 3 accounts, so to speak.
Mhm.
Right. It depends on how you define what you're looking for. Like it talks about the revenue goals. So they're looking at all 3 of those, but in terms of the actual policy, it's looking at just the unassigned. So that
Administration.
makes it, and that unrestricted piece might have been
Fiscal.
from the old policy that might have gotten missed when we updated it, or maybe it was intentional at this stage.
Oh, it's in-
Yeah.
I don't remember. But it's on page 27 of the policy, or on page 22 of the actual pages. So I'm not sure which one it is.
You say page 27?
27.
Nope.
I see it on page.
22 of the PDF.
Thank you.
27, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, so just go up a little bit more. So maybe it's the end of 26.
Okay.
Right there, it talks about the unassigned fund balance. And once it reaches more than 10% or above 12%, excuse me, all the little bullets tell you what you can use it for.
All right, so I'm sorry to hold up the conversation, but if I'm clear, we're not looking at the right thing with the information that's included in the agenda packet.
I think we are. I think what
Okay.
Ruth was
All right.
referring to is what happens when we go above 12%, 10 or 12%.
But Ruth is saying the definition of unassigned is not, unassigned is not the same as unrestricted.
Correct.
It's not, but the ratio in the policy is supposed to be unassigned,
Mhm.
not unrestricted.
So where the third paragraph down, tells us what the goal is.
For the unassigned fund balance.
Yeah, the town has set a goal through,
Okay. Okay,
Yes, so I think we were good here.
okay, okay,
I think where we're branching off to is what happens when you get over 10
Yep.
or 12%, then the policy dictates where
I
those
got a little
funds
lost.
go.
I'm good. I'm solid. Yep, I apologize.
I guess the takeaway is we need to focus more on building fund balance.
Yes. And that's something when I think do our goal setting as a council. we'll bring
Agreed,
up,
yes.
If the committee feels it's appropriate, that maybe that should be a focus of the budget, is to try to build that number. Okay, moving on,
Sorry.
that's
I
okay.
got unrestricted on unassigned.
You know what, we talk about this stuff and it becomes clear, I'm sure it's messy to watch, but it's helpful.
Well, I usually have it down pretty good. That's why not that time.
We have our assessor here, and Nick, you provided a wonderful document, has a ton of great information. I wanted to take a deeper dive into a couple of the pages, but I wanted to give you an opportunity to just introduce it, explain it a little bit, and then I'd like to talk particularly about the tax rate calculation, and then the TIF and CA summary that was included in the report, and you provided an expanded version earlier in the day.
Yeah, I'm happy to speak to it. Just so you know, if I'm brief at all, I'm happy to answer questions that I didn't speak to. And I also believe I'm going to speak briefly on October 6th to talk more about the commitment or other issues. So I won't go into all of that, which is already in this document. But this document that was included in the agenda is a compilation of a number of different documents related to the commitment. Some of it is the reports to the council on statistics from what happened year over year, kind of the overview, so the council and residents can be included in the differences and tracking of those figures. And then some of the documents within this larger compilation are official pages that I need to certify with the state, including the municipal valuation return, which all the figures within there are different reports or Excel spreadsheets that I run from the Vision Gamma software of all the properties and assessments in town. And then there's also a couple overview sheets like you alluded to of kind of the TIF numbers where they ended up at the end of the year and the top 10 taxpayers of the year. So that's just the overview. I'm happy to speak to specifics though.
This is probably one of my favorite reports that we get. There's a lot of detail. It's 30 pages or something. So if anybody wants to look through it, it's included with our agenda packet.
It's also on the assessor's website page of the website.
Perfect.
And I believe Vice Chair Hamel has requested that Nick give a brief presentation at our regular council meeting as well. So,
Yeah.
Yep.
Okay, so any questions on the general document from the committee? If not, I'd like to jump to a specific page. This is, I think it's page 19. His report, which is the tax rate calculation. So, and I thought it'd be good for us to just understand, we do the budget and then we don't necessarily know all the inputs to the final tax rate calculation at that time. But this is what I think it's the standard form that the state kind of describes, how we approach it.
That's correct. Every town uses this same form. The only difference would be if they have a lot of personal property in town over a certain threshold, which hardly any towns do. So this is the standard form. And this page is kind of the capstone of all the assessor's version of the tax rate comp sheet that you and the finance department, craft in the budget season. So some of the differences are though, that each line item for, appropriation isn't spelled out. It's the totals and the nets. And the total taxable real estate valuation and the personal property, like I was saying, those you'll find in other parts of this document, but they help build the calculations that at the end of this document, the gist of what we're trying to get to is what's the levy for the town once you plug in the selected tax rate. And if you go to the very bottom of this too, some of the blue figures auto calculate once you plug in some of the numbers that you have to provide. But it's the numbers, if you were to look at page 4 of this same document, not what the PDF is, but rather the label at the bottom, you'll see the type of document you're more accustomed to. And the numbers on here most directly apply to the municipal appropriation, the school appropriation, and also some of the line items below the line, if you will, on the tax rate calc sheet, which are the overlay and the Betty and the homestead reimbursements and the county assessment, all of those things.
So one thing I thought was interesting here was the only input for the schools on this is the local appropriation. So any funding that comes from the state doesn't really play a role, right?
Doesn't appear to unless it's considered part of their revenues. Which if it is, then that would be, this is only the net number.
So this year we had an order that if the, general purpose aid goes up, we're gonna take 50%, give it to the taxpayer, 50% go to a capital fund. So did you actually, you changed then that local
Correct.
appropriation?
That's included in that net number.
Okay.
Yeah.
At commitment, because
Yep.
there was guidance within the budget order to do so. Okay.
That number would have been higher had that not happened.
The other thing I thought was interesting, the municipal appropriation here is actually the net number, not,
As is the school. I had heard that that might be a question of yours. And it's just always been done that way in Scarborough and many other towns too, because the state doesn't have a preference on the matter. I know it does say other revenues that could reduce it, but as long as the number in blue, the total assessments is correct, it's always been done that way, that number is zeroed out the other revenues and the net budget for school and the net for municipal are what are plugged in these values.
so I'm reading this, the top half is all you, it's all
Yeah.
valuation and.
Yep.
And am I correct in saying the bottom half is either coming from state sources or the adopted budget?
Correct. The only difference would be the tax rate and the overlay. Everything else.
Yeah, from
Yeah.
line 10 down, essentially, is much of that is a function of our budget, kind of the net budget, how much needs to be raised.
Mhm.
I do have a question, Nick. I'm sorry, I should have asked you before.
Sure.
This 74, almost 74 and a half million,
Mhm.
that's the net, essentially, that's the amount to be raised by property tax. If you
Yeah.
look back at page 4, our property tax form, the number is about $2 million less.
Yep.
What
I can
accounts for that
speak to
difference?
that. So the difference would be if you add the homestead, the Betty, so you subtract homestead, subtract Betty and add in overlay,
Got it.
equates that number.
The other point I'd make, just make you aware of the line 20. The state statute allows, gives flexibility to the assessor to put the overlay, I believe, at 5% of the net budget.
Yeah, that's as high as you can go.
So just appreciate, in the end, the overlay that was fixed was 492, almost 500,000. It could be as high as 3.7 million.
And that's a lot of places, fund balance.
And they don't max it out, but you add 2 or 3 more pennies to the tax rate, and all of a sudden you've got some fairly significant money over time.
So back to we started talking about the valuation policy and rules and policy and a little bit in our last meeting. Let's say that we, for budget purposes, the valuation that we used as the basis was somewhat dramatically different than what you came up with the commitment time.
Mhm.
Is there something that we could do, put in the order, the budget order that says, directs you that we might want to create one of these funds or actually budget for fund balance in that situation? Or do we not have? that?
Although I won't advise specifically on this, I think in our prior conversation, we were saying you could have an expense line, and then if that money isn't available, cut that number. So plug it in as something you want to appropriate. And if the valuation isn't as high, then you could have a new budget amendment to reduce that.
Or your policy could dictate what happens in the event that the valuation at commitment is less than you anticipated.
Or you could allow the policy to
So
decide.
you could have a policy that would kind of put it on autopilot, not unlike what you've done, you know, as recent as this year, I guess. There was a suggestion that there was additional GPA. We didn't have it in hand. And so you said, well, if it comes, this is what we want you to do.
If you scroll up just a tad again to the appropriation kind of lines, that's within your domain. So if you increase those numbers, that's what I plug in there. So like you had said, the very top is what I use for my data. Well, the budget is your domain in conjunction with the town submitting their portions of it.
So the thought is to do a fund it first approach, so to speak, fund it first. And the reaction would be to reduce it. And I think
That's my thought, but I'm happy to let others speak to it. Because you had said previously, it helps you define, you know, your priorities. If it's a priority, you fund it, but if it's not there, then you can cut it with a budget amendment if necessary, or a policy.
I wonder if every year would end up like a reval year where we try to go through the exercise without that fund line. Right? Because when you fund it first, which is great, but you're funding it first, so you're increasing the mill rate, you're increasing the first reading mill rate, you're increasing all the mill rates, right? So which is fine, but that's what you're in for, right? So when you fund it first, that becomes part of the conversation, so to speak. Where in previous reval years, we've carved it out and almost run an alternative reality scenario and said, you know, we're gonna do this budget as if the reval never happened. You would almost be wise to do the same thing with this fund it first approach to say, you know, we're funding it, so to speak, but it would only get funded if the valuation comes up higher, you know, so it just leads to a communication challenge, but I think we talked about that at length, but that's just my first reaction to that.
Well, it does help though, through the budget, if it's super important that year that we
Just do it, yeah, right.
have it,
Right.
that we at least can consider other expenses if that's really something we want to build. And again, we might have to adjust and say, even though maybe every year we have a goal of X, we're going to cut that in half this
Right.
year because there's so many new expenses or things. So we're going to be flexible in the budget, but like have that starting point built in at the
Every
first
year,
read,
yeah.
just so that we can go backwards as opposed to try and add it in later.
It's
It
gonna
does-
be awfully hard to add it in because there won't be any room.
Yeah.
Yeah, I can certainly include it as an expense line, you know, let's just for discussion purposes, say we're gonna be a $300,000 expense line. I think you probably need something in that order of magnitude to start making headway here. I would simply, I would suggest that you need to keep that in mind when you're setting your overall tax rate goal.
That's what I'm saying, right?
That whether it's 3% less, you know, with not including that in the calculation, or it'd be something higher. You know, to add that sort of new expense into the budget, that either means we tighten elsewhere to stay within, you know, those historical limits, or you otherwise acknowledge that we've got kind of a unique and new thing, and our tax rate increase might be a little more this year.
Right.
Once it's built in, then you won't see that sort of thing. It will be, it's that first year, that transition year, that's the tough one.
Kind of the way I'm thinking about it right now, though, is there's a good chance we're gonna have strong growth again next year, right? I don't necessarily want to budget for that strong growth because it's not necessarily sustainable, but I don't mind putting a line item in that says, well, if it actually happens, we think it will, but we don't know for sure. We won't know for sure until next August. But if it does, let's fund this unassigned fund balance or allow that to grow somewhat. And then in a couple of years, we probably won't be in that situation anymore.
So I think the only thing I'd also offer, just recalling the conversation we had, was, you know, talking about that 90% threshold of growth from the prior year. You know, we budgeted, I think, whatever the middle number there was, you know, at 90 million. Well, we came in at 118 million. You know, so 90%, if we were to use that figure next year, you know, that'd be, I think, 106.7 million or something like that. So even if that was the rationale, we anticipate similar growth, and maybe that's not the answer, but what that would do for the mill rate projections right out of the gate would be discernibly different than budgeting at 90 million, right? So I think that was sort of the background context of that conversation, that we're going to start from a very different place if we don't budget so conservatively for additional growth.
Right, and that's the thing, is like, how much of this is us just trying to almost, dance around it, so to speak, right? Why not make your estimations, try to make your estimations more aggressive, less conservative? And do the 300, for argument's sake, do the 300 and get the growth right the first time, and see if we can actually budget it right.
Mhm.
Right, and so I think maybe that's a mindset shift we need to consider, because I think what we're trying to do, because we've lived the process, is like, we really want to do this, but we don't really want it to be part of the conversation unless we have it. But if we just, if there's consensus that we're going to 100, what did we say? Did we say 100% or 90%?
90%.
Right, we said 90% when Nick throwing caution flags at us. If we're gonna,
Thanks for remembering.
yeah, right. But if we're gonna say that, then in theory, that 300, I don't know the math quickly, but that 300 doesn't move the needle.
Yeah, I mean, the 16 million is like $240,000
Right.
with, of an additional value. So right there, you almost make your goal out of the gate. Now, if we only bring on 100 million, then you can make that budget adjustment to revise it down to 6 million and revise it down that expense line accordingly. That's far cleaner than trying to.
Right, and what you chose to do this year is to put half of that unexpected new value to lower the tax rate further. So we ended up at 1502 rather than whatever the projection was, and fund the capital equipment reserve.
I think it all went to the tax rate, right? For the value change.
I'm probably mixing,
The general purpose.
Yes,
aid,
you're right,
we
you're
did
right.
50-50.
Yeah, we get,
the capital.
we considered the value thing, but decided it would be too difficult to do it such short
Right.
notice.
We hadn't thought through it.
Yeah, we haven't thought, that's why we're having this
Yeah.
conversation.
Capital reserve was funded with known additional excise monies that would have otherwise been fund balance.
Right.
Yeah, I forgot that piece.
I mean, I just hear, all I'm hearing is, maybe this is too simplistic, but we should get better at budgeting. But I don't know, maybe that's just me, because I feel like a lot of that would change.
It's kind of like we're predicting right now we're going to be in a good situation. So I think we're feeling a little bit more confident and
Right.
having a much more, or less conservative approach. But again, when things change,
Right.
we might change that position where we might need to take a more conservative approach. But again, planning, like trying to look at it, I think year by year. And I like what we talked about last time of let's try and plan a little less conservatively, but still give the town manager the discretion to say 90% is not where we want to go at the start for this year. He or she would rather go somewhere else lower because of other circumstances that we just don't know will happen or could happen. Because again, I think, Tom, you said something that's resonated with me of like, this year was a great year, and it could be not a great year next year, like just like it was a great year this year. So we just have to be a little bit cautious, I guess, but still at least plan for success.
Remember, what we're talking about is the council, or is us estimating tax rate, in the springtime as part of budget. At the end of the day, the value will be what it is, what the assessor says it is, some months after adoption. So it's a matter of timing, and it's a fair comment. When historically we're asked to estimate value, we are, I think, understandably cautious and probably lowballing that number. Always rather under promise and over deliver, right? But of course, that's what grabs the headlines. As soon as I present the budget with an estimated tax rate that has a very conservative estimate on value increase, that's what grabs the headline. And then when it actually happens at commitment in August, no one's paying attention, and it's almost always good news. It's always lower than what the estimate was. So that in part was why we had this policy in the first place. I think I'm hearing it resonate again, that let's be a little smarter up front and help ourselves out so we have a little easier budget process. And I like our chances of being pretty close to that in the end as well.
Okay. I think that's what I wanted to cover on the tax rate page. I don't know if you have access to
The new one,
Yeah,
is the new one, did you put the new one on the agenda?
I can pull it up.
So the
You wanna just
TIF
share the screen?
CEA summary, is that what you're alluding to?
yeah, I think I liked what you put together. Right?
Sure.
I liked what was in the packet too, but it's getting even better. So to the extent we can bring this one up, that's great.
So just a little history on this. If you remember back in February for a finance committee meeting, I had provided a one-page version of this. This is now two and fleshed out a little further. I conferred with town attorney Shauna about what she thought would be the best representation of each of these TIFs and the layout of it. And this is just an overview of the facts for the most part. It's not suggesting anything beyond that. It's the base value, the base year, the term, the amount that was captured so far at the end of last fiscal year. It's not even including the stuff that's estimated for payout this year. So it's just a document for informational purposes for review. So we're all on the same page of the big line items of each of these. There's some more complex factors to each of these, obviously, that you can't fit on a one-pager, but it's a starting place for people that maybe don't know about the complexity of these to grasp the most important details.
So when you go through and try to identify what money should be set aside for TIFs, because that's your role, right? You actually do that calculation. What drives, like for the downtown TIF, for example?
Yeah.
We capture 3% of the value. Where do you get the 3% from?
So I may have to re-ask the question, but the 3% is what's in the downtown omnibus TIF document to date. That was the amount chosen to be captured. So what I'm doing as an assessor is, what is the assessment this year and what's the difference from the base value when it all started? The difference between the base value and the value on April 1st this year is the increased value. And the document stated that I calculate 3% of that.
So, and I don't know if anybody knows the answer to this. If we wanted as a council to change the 3%, do we need to refile?
Yes,
You think we do?
that's an amendment to DCD. I'm told it's fairly simple.
Okay.
Again, the test that they'll put it through is to make sure that the reasons that or the reasons that you're putting forward to spend the TIF funds qualify under the statute. And that was a discussion we started with Shauna, and we'll continue on and actually expect to have some detailed suggestions as to what else might we spend TIF dollars on that we're not already doing it. Right now, we're limited to traffic improvements within the district and economic development.
Okay.
Can we get this on, sort of listen to the agenda packet? I know it's retroactively, but this is, I think,
Oh, sure.
incredibly
On
useful.
this agenda packet?
Or wherever we would put this publicly, because I think we just got it, right? So,
Yeah. And
which
not-
is fine, because we
yeah.
asked for it after the fact. I'm just saying it's just incredibly informative and easy to
Yeah,
understand.
and not to be a stickler for caveats, but I did include one saying this is just a summary document,
yeah, yeah.
because it shouldn't be considered the letter of the law. It's not every financial statement to each of these payees. It's just the overview.
And this is a complete side note, but to me, this is a great example of a new counselor, or maybe myself 3 months from now, I would ask for this, and then I feel like it would get lost in the shuffle. So to me,
Mhm.
this is, to Tom and Liam, to me, this is a great example of where can I click that button and get this again,
Yeah.
right? So I know that's not what we're here for, but I want to point these things out when we come across them, because this is a great, somebody's going to ask about this
Sure.
repeatedly.
Yeah, the
Right.
beauty of this is says, all right, we have 3 different economic development TIFs, and for one, we have a CEA, and downtown, we've got 3 different CEAs. So yeah, it is.
Yeah. So that's just, where do we put that, and where do we put that so it's easy for all of us on the back end?
So one thing you might consider is you show the captured tax inception to date, right? Through the course of the TIF. It might be helpful to show what your projection is for the coming year.
Sure, that's on another document. If you go back to this original agenda document, it's on the second to last page of that. So the difference would be adding what's there and what's in the second to last page as the captured value or taxes rather on the second to last page. And if, in case helpful, I also did that calculation, not necessarily to keep forever, but just to show you if that's Liam, if you have letter E. I figured someone might ask that question. So that's what it is. If you add the already paid out to what is projected, if people pay their taxes this year and it all goes as planned. I just don't include it on the document because Shauna advised not to because hasn't happened yet.
Yeah.
So Nick, this is correct. This is the.
That's correct. Yeah.
Just one thing I'd like to comment on this, the last item, New England Expedition CEA, that estimated full payout of 7.7 million and change. That CEA actually tops out at 8.25 million and also no more than 825,000 a year. So presumably in FY23.
You see that 547, that's
There you go.
all will pay out to reach the maximum next year.
So
We're finally there.
we're going to be there in FY23.
I want cake and ice cream once that's gone.
It's not.
But if you go back to the other TIF document, the 2-pager, the summary,
Yeah,
and
this-
go
this
down to
really
the,
helped
and go down to the
clarify.
Haggis Parkway. If you see my note to the far right bottom, once the maximum payout has been reached, the capture can go back into the Haggis Parkway TIF as much as 62% over the life of it.
So to
So
the drag on our finances, because we have been funding the sewer payments, with general fund monies or with fund balance, I should say. Once we start flowing these monies away from the CEA and back toward the TIF, up to 62%, we'll be able to make pretty quick headway to remove that deficit.
So just tying all the conversations together, can we take the difference between what is coming out of the general fund to pay off the sewer? Right? Or something with the CEA and work that in with the fund balance discussion that we just had. 'Cause this is gonna get captured though, right? This is still captured. So this will be not in the,
until 2028, but it has to be used for the
The TIF.
delineated purpose, yeah.
yeah, it's all the same stuff that
So
we
we've
talked
been,
about.
right, we've
Yeah.
been paying for that debt service
Right.
with the general fund, and there's been a receivable
Right.
saying, oh, well, as soon as New England Expeditions, we'll eventually catch up and pay ourselves. back.
Only because the TIF is underperformed. The
Yeah, right.
expectation there would be sufficient funds to cover the debt. That wasn't always the case. We've picked up steam in recent years. So you look at the end dates for the Haggis Parkway TIF, the CEA for New England Expedition will be satisfied before the end date. So there'll be some runtime, 5 years or so, between.
Right, but we'll still be capturing that 62% in the.
We will.
Highway TIF.
But it's actually gonna flow to the general fund because we're
Right.
paying ourselves back. And
Right.
the thought that I had, now that everything's kind of laid out so clear, is why don't we capture 100%?
Right.
And pay ourselves back
Correct.
quicker, to
So
satisfy our rating agencies who are.
that'd be a question for Shauna, and that may be permissible, but another thing, I spoke with her earlier today, and she said it's also possible that could be extended to 30 years.
We'd have to refile and all that fun.
Which
You know how
it's
much
quite
we owe
easy
in
to
sewer?
amend one.
Sure.
It's not as hard as creating one.
Yeah.
The difference is there's some money flowing to the general fund already that we've become accustomed to. So
But it's all gonna go to the general fund after next year. When we start paying ourselves back for debt service that we've already paid. It's.
I believe it's a dedicated account, so it
Yeah.
might go back in the end, but it has to go
It's
to
gotta go there
this.
first, but then you're paying yourself back for debt service that you've already paid. So there's gonna be a transfer somehow. That's why that's why
we
the
need to be
rating.
very,
agencies-
very thoughtful through all this. The good news is, the end's near, the end's in sight here.
But just so I have an understanding, like Councilor Clucci has said, that's not gonna necessarily accumulate because every year, yes, we're gonna capture 62%, but we still owe ourselves money on the debt service for the sewage, correct?
There's debt service, but there's also a deficit that needs to be
Right, so
satisfied.
it's essentially passing through that TIF district fund back into the general fund pretty quickly.
That's
It's not
the way
gonna,
I'm
it's not going to
interpreting it.
accumulate. Right now, the downs capture measly 3% is accumulating. we're not expecting this to accumulate because we're gonna be using that 62% and pay ourselves back every year. Is that,
I don't know what the deficit, what the receivable is right
Yeah.
now. I don't know if Ruth is still on. She might know, but I think I'm understanding the mechanics, right?
So 1 point,
We've been saving essentially by paying, we've established a saving account.
yeah, I just want to think through it because I know the final debt payment extends all the way up to 2032. So there's 4 years beyond this as well.
can we put this specifically on the next finance committee agenda so we can all understand it?
Take us test?
Yeah, it's just so we're
Yeah.
not rushing through, and I
An
think
update,
Tom
yeah.
would probably feel more comfortable preparing a couple things.
Yeah.
Yep.
I like that.
Yep.
That is a good one to discuss, because as Tom was saying, and as the document says, we will complete the CEA requirements this coming year, so.
Right.
So there might be opportunity there. And then I think at the council level, we're already talking about the downtown TIF and
Right.
there might
Right.
be some opportunities
Correct.
there.
And so if we fold them both into the conversation, it might make sense. So.
Mhm.
Yeah, and I didn't see any others where like the affordable housing TIFs, I thought were all
That's on-
probably too
on the
small to
next
try to play
page,
with
yeah.
it. Yeah, which is the next page down.
The BOR zone TIF will expire in 2025. It's fairly small money comparatively. It's the first one on the first page.
And that's the one down on, not Route 1.
Yeah,
but
it's
Broadway.
the Humpty Dumpty building or Conica building.
Mhm.
But the other ones are further out.
So the affordable housing ones, they're not large dollars, so I didn't know that it would be administratively worthwhile to try to capture anything more than what we're already giving back in the CAs.
Right.
Many of them are already 100%. Oh, I see what you mean at CEAs, yeah.
So we'll take that on the next agenda.
Yeah, I think
For Higa.
I'd really like to understand it more and.
Yeah, and get maybe a little history of it too.
Yeah.
Because probably we might learn something from that experience for the downtown TIF, which is newer. Thank you, Nick.
Yeah, you're welcome.
That's very helpful.
I'm selfishly did it for myself as well. As soon as I got the job here, I wanted to know the mechanics of the TIFs, and I think it's helpful to for the average person that doesn't look at them every day to have something, a summary.
Very much so.
Can I just ask one question and it's probably a reminder question. So for the Avesta US Route 1 that we recently approved, right? That one fell under the economic TIF as opposed to an affordable housing TIF. Can someone remind me why we went down that path?
I think it's still an affordable housing CEA. It's just in the economic development TIF district. Right. So I think it's still an affordable housing CEA.
Okay.
Yeah, it just the name of the district didn't match the name of the CEA.
So
Yeah.
practically, we would have had to file a new TIF for that
To have
corner of the
affordable
parcel.
housing TIF there.
And you would have had to remove the portion of the parcel from the downtown TIF first, because it was already in it historically.
If you go to page 1, under the downtown TIF, that CEA is shown, the last
Yeah.
one.
So it would have been a lot more paperwork and
So we
to
just
amend the
leverage
downtown one to get it out first and then create a new one.
And John, just to pile it on, if you look here, we're still, because we didn't do it that way, we're also capturing an additional 3% into the downtown TIF
Mhm.
fund. So there's 78% being captured, 75% is going to the developer, 3% is going into the same 3% as the downs and all the other areas.
Mhm.
But it's the CEA still those guys need to ask for an affordable CEA. They can't,
Yeah.
they can't act, right?
And if we'd have done it as a standalone, I'd have probably put it in the same bucket as the rest of page 2, whereas administratively, it's probably not worth.
It would have just been a lot of, yeah,
Yeah.
it makes sense. Okay.
I never pull up the last page of the
Yep,
agenda.
I can do that.
can do that.
I want to do it.
packet. Right over.
You beat me to it.
Can you zoom in? So included with Nick's packet is the municipal valuation return that we submitted to the state. Well, every municipality in the state submits that to the state, and they, on their website, produce each year a summary of all of those submissions. That's something that I've been downloading for a couple of years. It's always lagged a year. So the most last year's will become available in a couple of months. I usually have to push them for it, and then they'll release it. But I thought it'd be helpful to see how much, what are some of our peer communities doing? And these are just suburban Portland. That's how I define peer community. You can look at it a bunch of different ways, and this is just the one I thought would be simple. So what this is showing that for fiscal year 2020, Cumberland captured, if you look at their captured TIF value in relation to the total valuation of the town. I call it real value here, but you can, similar to municipal value, basically. 7.6%. And the next column shows what their subsidy is from the state for school funding, and it's just over $5,000 per student. The other metric that I try to track is if you look at your overall equalized and just value per student, that's really what drives whether you're going to be a minimum receiver or not. So if that ratio goes way up, then you're probably going to be on your own a minimum receiver. If it stays below, like right now, probably 1.5, then you'll probably be getting funding from the state. Falmouth similarly captured almost 7%. They get out about $4,000 per student. Their ratio is a little higher at 1.3. Scarborough, we capture about 1.5% of our total value. And this is just for 1 year. Our equalized and just value ratio is 1.57. So we're teetering, we're pretty high. That's why we're right on the fringe of being a minimum receiver or not. And the calculations for school funding use a 3-year average. So we know in the past couple of years, our numbers have gone up somewhat dramatically, and our students have actually come down. So that ratio, there's a lot of upward pressure on that ratio. So I don't know next year if we'll be a minimum receiver or not. There's a lot of moving parts, so it's kind of hard to predict. But we get about $1,000 per student right now. And this, you can just see we're near the bottom of the pack. Freeport does capture a lot of value. They still are a minimum receiver.
So John, is it too simplistic to say that if we increase the captured TIF to real value, increase that percentage, we'll decrease the final percentage?
So yes, the equalized value. So if you increase that, if we increase our capture rate, and let's say we make it to 5%, that's going to reduce the numerator of that ratio, right? Somewhat substantially.
So yeah, by increasing that percentage, we're sheltering more.
Exactly. The other way to manage it is to have more students come to our schools.
That presents other issues.
It's a balancing
Yes,
act.
yeah.
Yeah. As long as you have the capacity.
Well, one, the council has complete control over, the other
That's
one,
right.
you don't,
That's right. Well, right.
unless you know. Over there.
We try.
So I just wanted to give that context for, as we're having this discussion, we're not abusing the TIF system. It's there for a reason. It's bipartisan, and there's a reason for it because
Yeah, though we may not be abusing it, we're not.
We're not utilizing it either. right?
we are not.
Yeah.
We are not.
And isn't that the kind of the entry point of the discussion with the council starting next week?
Yeah. I think there's opportunity there.
So I mean, just as a fun exercise, all other things being equal, more students would actually drive our ratio down.
It would, and
Right,
it
and
would keep
actually
us-
get more
more
subsidy per pupil.
So there is that fine line where it might be more financially advantageous to add 100 students
Yeah, right,
than,
yeah, Yeah.
but we don't directly control.
sure.
control that.
Do we know why Freeport's such an anomaly? Is that because of the LL Bean or is that because there's so few students up there? Like, why is that?
Um,
I guess I was just, do you have an idea, theory?
No, I don't know what their TIF is in Freeport. I imagine it's something to do with.
No,
the
but why is their equalized just value number so high
Yeah. They might, I mean, I guess what is it?
when they're
Small school system?
capturing so much?
So they have a lot of value per student.
Yeah, they just, yeah, so essentially they have a ton of value and not as many students.
Yes.
So the downtown area is probably worth $1 gazillion.
Yeah.
And they don't have that.
They don't
many
have any
kids.
people living
And they
there.
don't have anybody living there.
And there's a lot of small coastal towns where it's
Yeah.
the same people. You just don't have many families living there.
It's funny how we have such a high population, yet we're getting, right, but this ratio is so high,
It's.
Such a
well,
large population. Our
assessment might be
population's
able
not
to-
high all the time.
So they call it equitable, it's supposed to be an equitable distribution of the cost of school funding, right? But the value is different than the cash flow that you have or the money that you have. So it's not really a good measure of
Right, right.
affordability,
Hmm.
but that's the way we do it. And that's why, I think partly why you have opportunities with TIP districts to try to normalize the playing field. Because cities, for example, are hugely disadvantaged by the way
Yeah.
that this calculation works.
I mean, we're probably 7th or 8th in population in terms of size community. Whereas we're, I believe, number 3 for total valuation. Right?
3 or 4, yeah, we're tied
think we're
essentially
4,
for
right?
second
Yeah.
though with a couple of towns. It's only Portland that's leaps and bounds above us. We're close to York and South Portland.
So what we want to do, if we're growing, right, and capturing and, taking advantage of the TIF system, we don't want to be the fastest growing town according to equalized and just value.
Right,
Because we want to capture it and keep it out of that calculation.
And when we capture it, it keeps it out of the calculation.
Yeah.
Does it make sense to discuss some sort of policy that's, if we're gonna attempt to follow it, to say, hey, since we do have this mechanism of the downs, to say we want to try to get our captured TIF to real value at 3 or 4% within 5 years or what have you? I mean, that's aggressive, but
Maybe.
that's just.
But
a
you're
brainstorm.
focusing, the attention should be on the downtown TIF. It's 1,000 acres. It's in the area where
That's
we
my point.
expect growth and value to occur.
I'm just saying, if we're gonna take a strategic decision to increase the capture value, we have the downtown TIF. It might be worth considering a policy that says, hey, just like we're doing with fund balance, it's our goal to make our TIF to assess value, over 3% or over 4% in 5 or 6 years. Or
So I don't know where it starts.
Yeah, right.
Maybe it starts with a policy or maybe it's an action to increase what we're capturing now.
Yeah, yeah.
I don't really care. I guess I
Right.
just think we need to start somewhere.
I just wanna, again, push and maybe make sure I understand the comment about school enrollment, because I feel like we've partially made a very deliberate decision around growth to focus on high density, multifamily units. That's kind of like our growth strategy. If we shifted a little bit to say, well, let's have more single family, which would potentially lead to more students, how would that potentially impact this, right? Like it might be good to do some sort of alternative analysis to say, all things equal, what happens if we change the TIF value? What does that look like? What does that do? If we had changed it a little bit, but maybe change our position on housing mix a little bit, what does that do? And where do we find like that sweet spot, or is there a sweet spot? Because again, I think it could be both. Like it could be some of our policies around growth and housing. It sounds like that could also impact this ratio, right? Because I think the schools and the school funding, I feel like is always what we talk about when it comes to the challenges of maintaining the tax rate and things like that. And if we can find that balance between housing, TIF, and make sure our schools can handle that growth, then that could also be another mechanism to keep this ratio low so that we're continuing to not be minimal receivers.
And it's tricky. You want your schools to be full. That's how you're going to maximize
Yeah.
the subsidy, but you don't want it to be overfull.
Yeah,
And there's a lag between the time you implement a policy and what happens, the market could change. So
There's so many
It's tricky.
variables just within our town, and then we're part of a larger system. So I understand your point. I don't disagree with it, but there's so many inputs. I don't know how accurate we can be with predicting the future that way.
Yeah.
But I think you're raising the flag of the biggest concern is that things look promising because we're no longer minimal receiver. What happens if we make a decision based on that and then we slide back into that status? I suppose the council can react accordingly.
Well, John, I 100% agree with you, right? I think Councilor Cucci a year ago called it castration zoning or what have you, right? Like, for better or worse, this is nobody's fault, but for better or worse, multifamily equals high value and fewer kids, right? And that's the attractiveness of multifamily. However, that, perhaps that's level 1 analysis and we need to, we're dealing with a big section of our town. Maybe it's time to do a level 2 or level 3 analysis, right? And because certainly when we make decisions about the decisions we've made about these multifamily units at the downs and what have you, we haven't rolled out this level of analysis, say, okay, that's great. We understand that. We understand that that's high density, high value, fewer kids. Okay, yay. That's good. But then we never point to anything like this, right?
Yeah.
We never actually say, well, wait a second. Do we have room for 120 more kids? Does 100, even though it's counterintuitive and it doesn't play well in the press or what have you, is 120 more kids actually going to change that ratio to the point where we can not worry about fluctuating back and forth between minimum receivership, but know that we are solidly on the path to stay within being, having a subsidy. So we should probably challenge ourselves to consider, let's, when we're about to have a pretty large discussion about the downs, let's force ourselves to hold ourselves to that. Like, let's have that level 2, level 3 discussion on it.
So it's
Right.
something I might actually want to invite the school board,
Yeah.
finance committee and
That's a good idea.
start having that discussion. Because I mean, personally, I want balance, right?
Mhm.
And I think it's important to, the vitality of community to have balance. And I think our policies are a little bit geared towards, not having kids come to our town or additional kids come to our town. It's a little overly cautious in that direction anyways. Maybe there's some tweaks that we can make without,
Right.
that don't have too much risk.
Mhm.
I mean, I will say historically, the pattern had been, we were kind of on this free fall. Year over year, we're losing big chunks away from
Right.
from subsidy for schools. And we got to the point where the quicker we get to minimum receiver, at least, we bottom out and we can kind of reset and recalibrate. And so to your point, multifamily is high value, low kids, and not that was, directly part of the strategy, but it was, let's get to minimum receiver so we can stop this fluctuation year over year and reset everything. This is kind of a game changer now that we're surprisingly all of a sudden out of it.
I mean, by our nature, we're always going to be reactionary, right? We're never going to get perfect. By the time we think we figured this out, the
Yeah.
game will change in 3 years. So.
Maybe, but it actually changes slower than you might.
Yeah, well, yeah.
And then they'll change the state. The formula.
Somebody will, somebody will.
But I think the real big point though still that we're gonna be talking about, right, is that 3% is really low and we need to figure out what do we want to raise that to?
Yeah.
To, like, at a minimum, that's gonna help us. So that's like quite obvious, but I do think exploring the school piece and getting to that deeper type of analysis would be good.
And just so my understanding, John, this is us in this captured TIF value to real estate value. That's actually independent of us in sheltering 100% of it, sheltering more tax revenue in the downs, right? This is all the value in the downs is in this.
So
Because-
the captured TIF is just the CEA in the downs and the 3% in the downtown TIF.
Oh, so it's not the other 57%.
It is not. So
Okay, so if we
all of a
increase-
suded tomorrow decided to capture.
That number
100%.
goes
Oh,
up.
so we don't need a policy, we can just take an action. Like
That's right.
to your point, if we just, by virtue of capturing, let's say 100, because it's easy to understand, capturing 100%, that number automatically goes up.
And it's
Yes.
not
Okay.
huge
Considerably.
numbers today, but it's growing.
It's huge
quickly.
numbers tomorrow and the next day,
Yeah,
right?
exactly.
And, perhaps you're already aware of this, but say you did decide to change it to 100%. If you became a minimum receiver, you can change the percentage back down.
Yeah.
So you're not tied to the higher percentage forever.
Yeah,
If you get new input, that changes that decision in a future year.
Of all the variables, it's probably the most easily manipulated on the fly.
The one
That's
we
why
have
they
most
use a
control.
3-year average, I think, so to.
Right, it's a council action and DCD approval.
Is there any downside to doing that? If we assume that we could play around with the general fund enough, and we have enough qualified expenses to spend that money if we need it. Is there a downside to capturing as much as possible?
The argument that was put forward at the time that won the day, and why they stated 3%, is that they wanted that money, some portion, a majority of that money, to flow to the general fund unrestricted, to use for whatever we wish, either to reduce taxes or.
But the counter to that is you can take an expense line in the general fund and use it with the TIF,
Right,
TIF
and
revenue. So you can.
We've got to do that analysis to see if there's enough expense that's
Right,
already
is there enough?
in.
I guess that's my
general fund.
question, which is kind of what I was asking.
And there's kind of a lag. So this
Yeah.
is, so the temptation is gonna be, you want that money this year, right? So
Yeah.
use the downtown TIF. I think there's about 700,000 that we could have captured that we didn't. Well, that's 700,000. I might be misquoting. the
Yeah,
number,
sure.
but, that's money that is paying for something in our budget right now.
Right.
So if you capture it, you're gonna put it in a designated account.
Sure,
Right.
right.
And you have to have something filed that you can use this money for something
Right.
that, you might use in your budget anyway. But you're gonna get the benefit side of, lower county taxes, more revenue sharing. That's gonna happen right away, those two, but the general purpose aid is spread over essentially 4 years.
Yeah.
So you'll get that money back over 4 years, and that's where you get to your 60%, tax shift benefit.
Yeah.
But it takes you 4 years, so you
Yeah.
need that kind of discipline to say, oh, you know what, it's worth saving that money today. And maybe some of it I can use on regular expenses, but every money I put in this account, I'm getting, well, it's 60 cents on the dollar.
Yeah.
The one thing that Shauna did at the last workshop that she kind of saved to the end, and so to be honest, at that point, I don't know if I was fully following her, was when she was talking about the 57 cents to the dollar we lose. I almost feel like maybe next week with the council, she should start with that, because I feel like that is kind of
We are.
getting more to your,
Yes.
Yep, we've retooled it, so we're kind of fast forwarding and
Okay.
starting the conversation at the
She
shelter.
has a couple different, more robust graphics to talk about
Okay.
more.
'Cause
We,
I-
actually, it was your suggestion. She's doing the $10 million bill, like.
oh, cool.
yeah.
Yeah, because that's where I think that's the answer to your question, right? Is, or maybe the response back to the concern about, putting it towards the tax rate is like, well, we could do that, but then we're losing money in doing that. Am I following that?
Well,
correctly?
the sooner we do this, the better, because it's still, the downtown district hasn't really started, just starting to perform, right? This year, we started to see it, and it's going to increase exponentially here on out. So the sooner we do it, the better, because we're not accustomed to much tax revenue flowing to the general fund right now. If you wait 5 years and all of a sudden it's a significant portion and that gets pulled away, it's going to be painful. So the sooner we do this, I think the better in terms of the switch.
The other thing you want to think through is, you want to be careful which expenses you're earmarking for this, because the TIF's going to go away eventually, right? So you don't want to have a big shock to the system, and
Right.
it's 28 years away, but
Well, just so one more question, because I'm trying to understand this. The lag time with a 40% benefit, that doesn't require that we hold on to funds in the TIF.
No.
Okay, so I mean, because in my mind, simple example is, let's have Shauna, file something with the state that says that the debt service on the public safety building is a qualified expense, and just run that through our TIF every single year. I mean, that's, to be really simple, that's what I'm thinking in my brain.
then all of a sudden,
But,
growth in the
yeah.
downs is paying for 60%.
That's my-
Yeah, it's a percentage of, and to your point, John,
That's precisely my point. We can do that. We can
Right.
spend that money. It can be zero if we keep cycling it through the general fund.
we also set up the downtown TIF specifically because it allows us to cover lease expense. And we don't have any notably, but we may. And so, that would be a way to pay for the lease expense with non-existing taxpayer dollars. Future dollars.
Just another fact about the lag time. I may be wrong, but my understanding is that you wouldn't see the tax shift benefits for 2 years because the state valuation is from 2 years ago.
Right.
So it wouldn't hit that number for 2 years after you made the change.
So when you do your municipal valuation return,
Mhm.
what number do you put for the TIF, the captured TIF, like when you did this one?
Sure, I
Is it-
put the captured taxes amount that went into the dedicated funds
From prior years? So there's,
from this year.
okay, so the taxes that they paid this year,
So that calculation isn't done until the tax rate is fixed.
And so the MVR this year won't have a bearing on our state valuation for 2 years. That'll be the basis for our state valuation 2023 or something, or 24. There's quite some lag time.
okay, so there might be more of a lag than,
It's always 2 years after, I believe, like the 2021 state valuation that came out most recently was based on 2019 values.
So wouldn't that almost be to our advantage? Because if we acted now, it'd actually be essentially grabbing the downs from the very beginning.
it's close to it.
Yeah, or close to it. I mean,
Some of those notes, I would like to understand what the timing is. So if we make a decision to capture
right.
whatever it is, increase it this year, when does that start coming?
I think it'd be 2 years. Maybe Shauna
Or
could.
you'd be capturing it right away, but it wouldn't reduce the. municipal
Right, but the
value.
state wouldn't account for it for 2 years from when I captured it, or the town captured it through the
Okay.
tax commitment. And Shauna can speak to that if you have more questions, but I believe full benefit of the tax shift impact might occur 2 years after the commitment.
So for the schools, it starts 2 years and then because it's a 3-year average, it's more like 5 years before you get the benefit.
Tricky.
So to me, it almost sounds like, I know we talked about the 40, 60%, and when you shelter 100%, I mean, to me, it's almost akin to having income that's tax-free, whereas you're not, instead of getting, $100 and subject to taxes and everything else, you're gonna end up with $60 at the end of the day. This is, as long as you have the qualified expenses to spend that money on, that tax-free money, that's the trick, right?
And that's all I keep trying to hammer home.
In terms of how this intersects with, your county valuation and revenue sharing, it's almost like you're taking that income off the books, so you're sheltering that income. So then you get, it's more like lucrative financial aid, right? You're inherently your benefit goes up because it's on a reduced amount of value or income as we typically look at from a household standpoint. I think that's sort of the narrative that you want me to what?
Stop the share just because I got
So Paul and I
So
had
is
a
it-
little interaction with, stepping through what happened if it would have been 100% this year, right? And there is in theory, a hit to this year's bottom line because all of a sudden you're taking, like, say, 600,000 and putting it in a dedicated account. But as long as what you're going to be eventually spending it on is something that you care about and is worthwhile, the fact that you put it away is eventually going to give you, 40% or 50% of the DAC. But all you have to do is, let's say we have some capital projects that we appropriated, right? So just issue debt for that.
Right, that's
That's
right.
it's essentially free money.
I like your analogy, and I live in analogies, so I appreciated that, because again, like the way I think of it, and correct me if I'm wrong, is it kind of like I'm setting aside a college fund for my kids that's not taxable to make that investment that hopefully I have that cash in the future to pay for them, that I don't have to necessarily, get taxed on when it comes to tax season. So that's where raising, okay.
It's the whole idea around any sort of non-taxable benefit. I mean,
Yeah.
if you have $100 medical bill, you can choose to set that money aside pre-tax and pay that dollar for dollar, or you can not do that. And you're going to pay a tax, so you're paying more for it. So I think in terms of the capital expenses, that's probably an apt analogy for people to understand the benefits of sheltering more of your revenue, and again, the financing component of that is, if you make $100,000 a year and you shelter 30,000 of it, and you're looking at financial aid, well, again, you're going to get whatever that benefit is.
I just think
Probably
these
an
are
analogy for it as well.
useful analogies, like as we make decisions on this and bring it to the public,
Yes.
putting it in the terms of things that they're familiar with.
The
I
HR
think-
guy,
Yeah.
examples.
Yeah.
But the only difference between this and your kid's college fund is we can spend it every year if we want to, unqualified expenses. So I just think it's,
Yeah.
to your point with the public, I think it's important
Mhm.
because what won the day 3 years ago was a concept that we're, quote, robbing Peter to pay Paul, or how are we taking that out of the general fund because it won't benefit the taxpayer? Well, that's absolutely false. We can shelter it first and we can spend it all in the same year if we want to. I'm not saying we should. But I think it's being very clear what the mechanism is,
Yeah.
right? And that's how we ended up at 3%, was because the council, frankly, we did zero prep as far as understanding what we were doing. We voted on the Downs, the CEA first, and then the TIF district, right? And so, our heads were spinning. And there was so much time around the Downs and the CEA that we never even remotely discussed or even tried to understand the mechanism of the TIF district. Zero. And that's not a knock on me or Tom or anybody, but I think Tom would probably agree. And so the simple analysis was, well, wait a second, it's not going to go to the general fund. Well, that's okay. There can be other expenses that are carved out of the general fund, so
Mhm.
I just want to keep hammering that home because I think it's important to say, we're not going to squirrel away 600 grand every year and pass that 600 grand on to the taxpayer. That's not what we're trying to do.
Mhm.
Yeah, Councilor Babine at the
We
time,
could, but we're not going to,
Councilor Babine at the time was advocating for 10%, as I recall.
Right.
And I think you're right. I think the councilors just weren't in a position to be comfortable anything
Correct.
more than that.
Yes.
But there was an acknowledgement, let's do this now. Let's revisit it in the future. And I think here we are.
right. And nobody did it maliciously. It was just, we were so overwhelmed with the Downs decision.
There's enough. to
We
do.
spent no time understanding this mechanism.
Mhm.
And so we're literally 3 years later, finally trying to say, let's really try to understand.
But just keep in mind, to the extent that there are costs that we're already paying for in the general fund, in the budget, that we can use these funds for, those TIF revenues would actually come in as a revenue into the general fund. So the
Right.
expense still exists. We just have a dedicated revenue stream to pay for them. We're not raising them, through the net appropriation to the tax levy. They are created, set aside, and can be used and will be used for that purpose. So in many cases, there'll be a direct offset.
Right.
Those costs are still being covered.
But every dollar there now is like
Is
$1.50 or,
$1.57.
that's a crazy tax.
Mhm.
60%? That's
Yeah.
a lot.
And when this starts to pick up steam, it's going to be real money.
Everybody good with that?
Yeah.
Next item was public comments. I don't know if there's anybody in the public that would like to comment.
Just you. You're
Just
the
me?
only, you're
I'm
the
good.
only attendee in this meeting.
I did that in case I had to share my screen. I'm glad I didn't. I would have gotten lost. So thank you, everybody. With that, can I have a motion to? adjourn?
Actually, can we just, I just want to report out just quickly. I know that we don't often, I know we get lots of, have lots of discussion about capital plans through this committee, particularly on the budget. And just wanted to provide, I think one update was provided to the council, but just want to share that out. If you recall in our FY22 capital plan, I believe we had about a $550,000 placeholder for replacement of SCBA's for our fire department. So a huge, pretty large cost. Just want to recognize the efforts of Chief Thurlow and Deputy Chief Lamoria, who did obtain a grant through FEMA, which we expect to realize about $437,000 to directly offset that anticipated expense. There's still a 10% match. We're not really sure until we spec everything out what that cost will be. Again, I think that we're projecting maybe a $50,000 or $60,000 local cost, but that certainly beats the $550,000 we thought we were going to have to expend to outfit the whole department with new SCBA's, which are reaching the end of life.
Are
So
we bonding that? Or-
I expect we may have
I think it was actually in the,
FY23.
yeah, you didn't appropriate it yet, but it's in the CIP. It's coming at us next year. So
Would have.
Fantastic.
Oh, I thought we had our fund balance for the year.
No,
I'm sorry. I apologize.
No, it's a phenomenal job. I think he sent out something, I think Don and I got it a couple weeks ago and
Yeah.
But I think it's it's certainly a good illustration of, even though we sort of have these placeholders in the capital plan, just because that's the plan doesn't mean we don't explore other options. And just one other example, I just want to give some recognition to Mike Shaw and his team, specifically Ed Alden, who's our vehicle fleet maintenance manager. If you recall, and this one is, I believe, in the FY22 budget, we had originally come into the budget season with about a $310,000 placeholder to replace one of our street sweepers. We did revise that down to about $270,000. Through some fairly exhaustive research, talking to other municipalities, it looks like the option we're going to move forward with is going to cost about $205,000. So again, about $65,000 savings to the town. And I think it's going to be a superior product in many respects. So just a footnote, I know we go through the capital process every year. We sort of have these discussions about these huge costs. I don't think we ever really circle back, particularly with the efforts that staff really do make, even though the money was there. They do really go the extra mile to make sure that we're not spending needlessly or anything more than we have to.
Fantastic. Thank you for that.
Mhm.
motion to adjourn?
So move. Second.
Second?
Wait, second.
I did ask it like a question. It was the wrong emphasis. I'm Ron Burgundy. Yes.
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 Hopefully one.
Thank you, everybody.